Good evening and welcome to this evening's debate. It's a great pleasure to see so many people here this evening. It's probably about 3 times bigger than any previous Intelligence Squared debate, and in a very sort of appropriate setting, Methodist Central Hall, for tonight's subject. I'd like to thank very much our distinguished panel of speakers and also our moderator this evening, Joan Bakewell, for kindly agreeing to participate. And also thank you to the Times newspaper, our media sponsor. Our next event, there's a free event that is taking place tomorrow night. It's not a Intelligence Squared style event, it's a question time, which we're doing in conjunction with the National Trust on, never mind, the ice caps. And that is a free event which is going to take place at the Royal Geographical Society with David Miliband, Rosie Boycott, Professor Philip Stott. After that, we have 2 more. Our next debate is Prison Works with Lord Woolf, and after that, Democracy Isn't for Everyone. You've probably seen we've previewed the autumn season, which is going to, and tickets will be available on sale probably the end of April. First debate is Britain has failed Zimbabwe, so we're rather hoping nothing happens to change that motion. Anyway, all it does is to leave me to thank you all for coming and to pass over to Joan Bakewell. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It's a tribute to the power of ideas and to the distinguished panel that we have today that tonight's motion has attracted so many people to come to hear. The motion that we'd be better off without religion. It will be conducted like the formal debates of the Oxford and Cambridge unions, with the 3 speakers on either side whom we will hear. We will then have the result of the pre-vote in which you've already cast your judgment, and then we will have questions and answers before a re-vote on the motion. Fine. So let me call upon the person who is to propose this motion. We would be better off without religion. Christopher Hitchens, author, journalist, critic, writer over here, a figure in the cultural life of this country before he moved to Washington, where he wrote for Vanity Fair and The Nation. He started off on the left wing, moved very right, and has recently been defending the neocons, and his latest book, which is absolutely germane to this subject, is to be published in the coming months and is called God is Not Great. Christopher Hitchens.
Thank you, John. You'll give me a minute, won't you? Thank you very much, Joan, for that slightly misleading introduction to someone who may no longer be a socialist, but still vibrates to Marxism. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. I think I'll be able to be reasonably terse, given the very heavy artillery that follows me on our side. I think it might perhaps have been felt when I was chosen that the case for atheism should not be made by the spokesman for its moderate wing, Richard Dawkins. It might be okay to have at least one extremist on the panel. And I'll begin at once by recalling an exchange I had recently in Colorado Springs with a spokesman of America's evangelical broadcasting wing, a much overrated but nonetheless significant force in American politics. This broadcaster asked me, in response to my own statement of unbelief, he said, "I insist that you answer the following question, and that you answer it with a yes or a no." I braced myself. I accepted the challenge unseen. He said, "You are to imagine yourself in a strange city where you've never been before. You are to imagine nightfall coming on, and you to be without friends or succor in this town. And you are to ask yourself whether you would feel safer or less safe when you saw a dozen men coming towards you in the dusk, if you were to know that they had recently come from a prayer meeting." This is I think I can justifiably say I'm relaying to you, comrades, friends, brothers, sisters, the challenge that was put by the religious to me. You'll see at once it's not a yes-no answer. You can't give a yes-no answer to that, but I accept it anyway. I said, very well, I won't give a Sesame Street reply, but just without leaving the letter B, I have been in that situation. In Bombay, in Belfast, in Beirut, in Belgrade, in Baghdad, and many other places too. And I won't tell you about all of them, but let me just, as it were, fill in some of those latent blanks. In Belfast, the capital city of one of the provinces of this, our United Kingdom, as everybody here knows, everything, culturally, educationally, economically, politically, socially, has been very gravely retarded for at least a quarter of a century. At least half a century and maybe more since partition, and before that, because partition is both the outcome and the cause of sectarian warfare in this town, by the simple fact that there are people there who are willing to kill not just one another, but one another's children on the basis of what kind of Christian they are. Horrible things are done, not just in pubs and clubs, but on the streets, on housing estates, on university campuses in that city still, despite the relatively good news we've had today, where the situation remains dominated by barbaric sectarian party leaders, on this and no other basis. Both churches demand that their children are sent to separate schools. They each agree with the other that above all things their own children must be protected from the faith of another faith. I don't think I need to elaborate very much more on how horrendous the consequences of that have been, and how they are enshrined, by the way, in our own constitution, which mandates that our own head of the church is also the head of the state and of the armed forces, with all the ludicrous Windsor consequences that you get if you found a national church on the family values of Henry VIII. These conditions, which are farcical in England, Wales and Scotland, are tragic and ugly, only a few minutes flying time from where we sit. If I pass on from Belfast to, say, Baghdad, where I've recently been, and without reopening any of the arguments about the rightness or otherwise of the coalition intervention in Mesopotamia, I think it can be granted by any fair-minded person that what was most needed in Iraq after 30 years of fascism and war was a period of reflection, a short interlude of calm, during which Iraqis could look about themselves and decide perhaps whom they'd like to vote, perhaps what kind of country they'd like to live in, what kind of federal system they might wish to evolve, and to do so unmolested by violence or terror. The parties of God have vetoed every hope of that process. The parties of God now have the Iraqi people in their jaws, and they're saying to them, it's not enough just to kill foreigners or to rail against Jews or Christians or secularists. That's nothing like enough. It's only in Iraq, not only, mainly, chiefly in Iraq, that it's considered perfectly all right, in fact, a religious duty to blow up the mosques, to destroy the religious schools of other Muslims, of the Muslims of another school, not unlike the pattern of Belfast. It's not enough to have faith, you must have the right version of your own faith, or risk death, mutilation, and humiliation, and the destruction, the immiseration, the torture of Iraqi society is something that all of us can read about every day. Suppose we're to go to Beirut, the pearl of the Levant, the most civilized and beautiful and cultured city of the Middle East, and to see what happens when, for politicized reasons, a sectarian constitution is in place which says that the president of Lebanon must always be a Maronite Christian, that the speaker of its parliament must always be a Shia, that its vice president must always be a Sunni, that the Druze must have their share, and so on, leaving out at the very bottom, I'm afraid, such forces as Kurds and Armenians, but making everyone defined in their citizenship by their faith. Do I need to elaborate what that's done to retard, to bankrupt, to beggar, to disfigure, and to degrade what could have been an ideally plural and diverse and happy society? Remaining with letter B, shall I say Banja Luka? Shall I say Belgrade? Or just say Bosnia? Again, one of the most civilized enclaves of the Balkans. For many years, protected by a secular constitution and the remains of what had been a secular and democratic republic. And just look what happens when it is decided that it is a matter of faith that determines your citizenship, your allegiance, your identity, your nature, your rights. See the recrudescence in the Europe of the late 20th and early 21st century of Catholic fascist parties we thought we'd left behind at Nuremberg, the Ustasha. The recrudescence of forces like the Chetniks, the Serbian Orthodox fascists who took exactly the same view except the other way around. See the craven way in which our spineless media, which always defers to people of faith, say that it was Serbs who shelled Sarajevo or Croats who shelled Mostar, when what they should have been saying was, today the Christian Orthodox militia bombarded an open city round the clock, or yesterday the Catholic forces shelled Mostar from dawn till dusk. They didn't do it because it's a matter of taste. We're supposed to respect people of faith, and we're supposed to respect them while they do that and do that and make this sort of excuse. There aren't enough words in my lexicon, at any rate, to express the contempt that I think any right-thinking person must feel for this conscription of this kind of medieval barbarism. Joan will tell me when I've got a minute. I don't know whether I'm yet trespassing on my rivals and my allies' time, but if I was to add Bombay to this list, the city that was very nearly ruined by the sectarian partition of India in 1947, 1948, where once again people were told it's a matter of faith what kind of Indian you are. You may have to become a Pakistani if you're Muslim. You may have to lose your life on the proposition. You may not just be a Hindu. Bombay more or less survived this, the terrifying ethnic cleansing and the pogrom that ensued when the subcontinent was mutilated and maimed and partitioned on this basis in the hopes of a genuine Indian unity and independence, ruined by way of appeasement of people of faith. But Bombay sort of recovered until recently, when now its name has been changed, its minority citizens persecuted, intimidated, driven out by a new Hindu nationalist party, the Shiv Sena, that says that, again, if you do not follow the right God, if you don't accept the supernatural as a real force in everyday life, you are not worth whatever it takes to become or to remain or be treated as an ordinary, democratic, civilized human being in, again, one of the great cities of Asia. Now, it's not part of my case, and I'm sure it's not part of Professor Grayling's or Professor Dawkins' either, to say that religion is the reason for all of this, or the exclusive or sole reason for all of it. I think it would be crude and reductionist to say that. But who is going to argue, I'll be fascinated to see, who is going to argue that the matter of faith, that the religious allegiance, that the preachings of religion have not in all these cases gravely exacerbated, gravely deepened, gravely poisoned and prolonged all of these things that have made our tenuous civilization extremely difficult to defend, uphold, maintain, let alone to advance. I don't believe this case could be made. That's for a simple reason, because religion is not provided to us by revelation. It doesn't come from the heavens. It doesn't come from the beyond. It doesn't come from the divine. It's man-made, and it shows. It shows very well that religion is created, invented, imposed by a species half a chromosome away from the chimpanzee. It shows, doesn't it? Well, why do we deceive ourselves on this point? And is there anywhere, I'm now going to wind up, is there anywhere of the places I've mentioned, and I exempt Basra and all the other B's I could take you around, where it wouldn't be enormously welcome if there was a mass conversion to secularism, or a mass adoption of the secular idea and principle, of the principles of Bertrand Russell, who once spoke famously from this platform, of Thomas Paine, of Thomas Jefferson, of Voltaire, and others. And I'll close by saying that I want you to be on your guard against two false issues in this respect, and I'll be very brief. When I mentioned those gentlemen, and I could mention some ladies too in this connection, like Mary Wollstonecraft, don't let anyone tell you that, oh well, secular tyranny is just as bad. After all, there have been fascist and communist dictatorships which have been just as revolting. Fascism, as you know, was supported by the Catholic Church all through its life, and in fact till after it had died, and still is defended by it. One of the leaders of the Axis was actually, the Japanese leader, was actually a god. There's no way of saying fascism and National Socialism in the Axis was secular. And in the case of Stalinism and Maoism and the Khmer Rouge, the same mistake is made, and a religion is made out of man. It's the religious impulse itself that I think we need to oppose, to criticize in ourselves as well as in others. The argument from faith, in other words, the argument from certainty. So those of us who maintain this may not be described, my closing point, as fundamentalists or secularists, as certain cheap and demagogic and opportunist forces have recently been suggesting. We do believe in evidence, we do believe in skepticism, we do believe in reason. We hold our views with as much conviction and principle as any God-botherer does. But we are open to the argument, and we're going to prove it tonight to you. And don't let anyone dare to imply there's a moral equivalence between us and the fanatics and the fools and those who think they know God's will and can tell you what it is, who are our enemies, and your enemies too. So, I beg to propose the motion that stands in our name. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot more than nine. Yeah.
The motion is opposed by Dr. Nigel Spivey, who is a teacher of classical art and archaeology at Cambridge. His books, which are many, include Songs on Bronze, Greek Myths Retold, and he has done several television series, of which one was called Digging for Jesus. Dr. Spivey.
The proposer of the motion began by saying he was putting the case for atheism. And with respect, Christopher, I'm going to start by saying this isn't a debate about the existence of God. It's a debate about us mortals, the crooked timber of humanity, and how the practice of religion in general affects us. Karl Marx famously described religion as an opiate. Jonathan Miller thinks it's more of an amphetamine, gets people overexcited, and my own meagre religious experience disposes me to think of it as a sort of anesthetic, by which I mean that when I am in situations of feeling lonely, sad, or frightened, I find myself crooning hymns that really relate to the place where we are. They're mostly Wesleyan hymns, but anything really that has the sentiment of Psalm 23 and helps one whistle and sing through the valleys of fear and death. But I'm not here to testify as a somewhat lapsed Methodist, but instead to deliver such academic expertise as I have to offer on this topic. It's brief, has to be brief, but in my view it is so compelling that when we arrive at the conclusion in 6 minutes' time, I'm half afraid that everyone will walk out. And I'd like you to promise not to do that. Otherwise, this will be an embarrassment to the organisers and to ourselves. I'm going to talk about archaeology and anthropology and start with the news from archaeology, the long-term view. As far is that a better? As far as we can tell, the species of Homo sapiens roamed the world for thousands of years before becoming, as it were, religious. Something radical happened in our minds, our cognitive systems, about 40,000 years ago. We started to make things for the sake of beauty, not utility. We started painting pictures, carving sculptures. We started using symbols, and that probably included talking to each other, making music, painting our bodies, and so on. This is referred to by archaeologists as the creative explosion, and it's a consensus that there's this kind of grand collective takeoff of our human capacities in the Stone Age, or the Upper Paleolithic to be precise. And one aspect here I think I ought to highlight, which is that one of the features that appears at this time, 40,000 years ago, is that humans start burying each other properly. And they start, with these burials, to put down flowers, gifts, and other signs of what we take to be some kind of succor or consolation, and possibly a belief in an afterlife. There is some debate about whether our doomed rivals, the Neanderthals, had these sensibilities, but the consensus is that Homo sapiens is a species uniquely hardwired for metaphysics. I've written about this in an understated book called How Art Made the World, and I'm not going to go on any more about it. But this archaeological evidence for the genesis of art, religion, and culture in the creative development of Homo sapiens is not easily discounted. And it sets up an evolutionary pattern. It explains why, I think, when John Lennon or Richard Dawkins asks us to imagine a world without religion, you find your mind wandering, and you're wondering what a world would look like without King's College Chapel, without the Taj Mahal, without Hagia Sophia, the Blue Mosque, the Parthenon, the Pantheon, the Sistine Chapel. Venice I've got down here, and I think just about all of Venice qualifies. And you become aware that even while Nietzsche in the 1880s was declaring that God was dead, at the same time you've got Van Gogh manically daubing away out of religious fervour, and a little later on that you find Kandinsky more coolly explaining why this nexus of art, music and spirituality made such an essential and indissoluble alliance for our quest for transcendental satisfaction. And it's why, when I'm asked to imagine a world without religion, it does tend to end up looking like, dare I say, a suburb of Swindon, with the only spire that pierces the sky is the Tesco's clock. Well, we've got a few minutes for the anthropology here as well. Once upon a time, there was a classics don at Cambridge who sat in his study, and he compiled a voluminous series of case studies gathered from around the colonized world about how pre-industrial societies kept up peculiar and primitive practices. So they cowered when the thunder started rolling, they danced for rain, they would copulate in the fields to ensure a good harvest, and so on. It's a literary masterpiece, this work by J.G. Fraser, The Golden Bough, subtitled A Study in Magic and Religion, and in Fraser's words, it set out to chart the long march, the slow and toilsome ascent of humanity from savagery to civilization. Beautifully written, but it's all tosh, and most anthropologists would say so today. In fact, it was not an anthropologist, but another Cambridge individual, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who made some remarks, offhand as it seems, about Fraser's Golden Bough, and pointed out that Fraser's method was fundamentally mistaken. Fraser supposed that savages, these so-called savages, made their sacrifice to graven idols, or they danced for rain, out of ignorance and superstition. But as Wittgenstein argued, the essence of ritual is performance, it's expressive. It's something that you can't gloss with a reasonable explanation. In Wittgenstein's word, we can only describe and say, human life is like this. Have I got time for an analogy? 1 minute. Probably not time for the analogy. I was going to tell you about the risks of attempting to react violently to a computer when it does something stupid, which is based on the analogy that Wittgenstein gives of hitting the ground when you're angry. It's not because you think you're going to hurt the ground, it's because you want a release of rage. I will just briefly, incidentally say that it is a very bad idea to hit a laptop. William James, the American psychologist, showed a century ago that there is no logical connection to be made between the fact that our ancient ancestors made errors of scientific reasoning, mixed them up with their religion, and the conclusion that all religion is a big mistake. Logically, that just does not work. If I had another hour here, I'd like to expatiate on the extraordinary phenomenon of how one religion overlaps with another, and how especially the persistence of sacred behaviour from the pagan to the classical world is something, the yew trees in the churches, the roots of the cult of the Virgin in antiquity, and so on. But I'm going to end up by saying that around the world, whatever we say here tonight, around the world the sea of faith rolls on. It rolls on because faith is not some kind of atavistic relapse, but part of our creative and ingenious nature. It's a force by which we humans survive. And the conclusion is that this fact is attested archaeologically, anthropologically, psychologically, and, I dare say, neurologically. And the conclusion would be that for the next hour or so, can I tell you this? In a sense, we are wasting our time debating that we'd be better off without religion. It's not an option. Religion is part of our human makeup, and it's going to be a very interesting time that we spend, but essentially it's not a topic for debate. It's the way that we are.
Brilliant. Well done, Nigel.
Seconding the motion is Professor Richard Dawkins, whose many books I'm sure you are familiar with. The Selfish Gene started in 1976, and there was a torrent of books that followed with wonderful titles like The Blind Watchmaker, River Out of Eden, Unweaving the Rainbow. His present book has no such romantic title. It has a very strong punch to it. The God Delusion was published late last year and was quickly a bestseller and has caused something of a sensation. So I call upon Professor Richard Dawkins to second the motion.
I do not believe that religion is the root of all evil. Thank you, Channel 4. Religion is the root of quite a lot of evil, but that didn't make for a very catchy title. I just want to briefly reply to Dr. Spivey a couple of points. He says we're fighting a losing battle because religion is a part of our human nature. Well, speak for yourself. It's not a part of mine, and it's not a part of the great majority of my friends in universities in England and the United States and elsewhere. He also said, if we had no religion, how would we do without King's College Chapel, the Sistine Chapel, etc.? Well, you know, artists have to make a living, and in the time when the Sistine Chapel was built and its ceiling was painted, you know who had the money. Artists such as Michelangelo had to go where the patronage was. We shall never know the ceiling that Michelangelo might have painted if he had been commissioned to paint the Museum of Science, for example. We shall never know what Haydn's Evolution oratorio might have sounded like, or Beethoven's Mesozoic Symphony. Now, I suppose that apologists for religion would be likely to put forward 4 reasons for believing it to be a good thing, 4 things that religion does for us, and I call them explanation, exhortation, meaning morals, explanation meaning explaining the world, where we come from, where the universe comes from, and so on. Exhortation, what is good, what is bad. Inspiration and consolation. And I think my colleague Anthony Grayling is likely to cover some aspects of exhortation. I shall be brief on that, therefore. Consolation, I often encounter people who say, but if you take religion away from people, how are they going to survive? How are they going to manage when they're bereaved, or when they lose a loved one, when they fear death themselves? And it's a reasonable point. It is certainly possible to obtain consolation from a lie. Many people will say, if you ask them, would you like your doctor to tell you when you have a mortal illness and you're only going to live another 6 months? There are people who will say, no, I would rather my doctor lied to me. And that's fine, and I would respect that wish if I were a doctor, if I thought that a patient wanted to be lied to. But I don't think it's a very dignified, general reason for supporting religion that it supplies consolation, unless, of course, it's true. And we haven't time to go into it, but I think there are very, very good reasons for thinking that there is absolutely no grounds for believing that there's any actual truth in the claims of religion. So those who gain consolation from religion, I must confess that I rather liken it to a child with a dummy in its mouth. I don't think it's a very dignified, a very respect-worthy posture for an adult to go around sucking a dummy with a comforter, which is what I think it essentially is. Inspiration, well, I've always found the inspiration, the heavens declare the glory of God, all things bright and beautiful, and so on, to be paltry, parochial, small-minded, compared to the inspiration that you can get by looking at the world of science. Deep space, deep time, as the late Carl Sagan showed us. Deep complexity in the study of life. The scientific study of these profound, beautiful, elegant mysteries is one of the greatest achievements of the human spirit. And insofar as religion offers an alternative or even positively stands in the way of scientific activity, then I think we would be well rid of it. Which brings me to the other of my 4 categories, explanation. In the field of explanation, science has all the cards. Religion used to aspire to a reasonably good hand, but no longer. There is no reason to suppose that any religion, any religious book, any religious teacher has anything to say whatsoever about such questions as where the universe comes from, what life is all about, what life is for, any of those questions, which once upon a time religion provided the best available answers. These are now completely washed up. There is no evidence for them at all. And it's worse than that, because the point I want to end up with is that religion debauches education insofar, and it's quite a long way, insofar as it interferes with the education of children and students. It's not just the teaching of falsehoods, it is that the indoctrination of children in the virtues of faith leads them to be immunized, to be placed on their guard against the enemies of faith, who they are told will come. It's as though it's rather like a computer erecting a firewall to prevent incoming information. I have talked to colleagues in America, scientists attempting to lecture to students on their subject, biology, and of course biology makes no sense without evolution. And whenever a lecturer mentions evolution, he sees a great sea of heads shaking, arms folded, and they are not listening. They are trained to give the right answers, they're trained to tick the right boxes when they do the exam, they know how to answer an exam on evolution, but they have been forewarned, forearmed by the firewall of faith. Whenever a teacher says anything about evolution, in effect, stop up your ears. Now that is debauching of education. A quote from Kurt Wise, who is an American geologist. He studied geology at Harvard, no less, under Stephen Jay Gould, no less, and he was set for a good career as an academic geologist, which all his life he had desperately wanted. The problem was, it came from within, it was his religious upbringing, his firewall of faith. And he couldn't reconcile the two, his scientific education with his religion, and he literally got a pair of scissors and went right through the Bible and cut out every verse that would have to go if he accepted his scientific education. And in the end, he decided there was nothing left of his Bible. He therefore tossed out science and said, and from then on, he said, with that in great sorrow, I tossed into the fire all my dreams and hopes in science. And he goes on, I am a young age creationist because that is my understanding of the scripture. As I shared with my professors years ago when I was in college, if all the evidence in the universe turns against creationism, I would be the first to admit it, but I would still be a creationist because that is what the Word of God seems to indicate. Here I must stand. If religion can do that to a highly educated Harvard geologist, just think what it can do to an average school child or student. Thank you.
Our next speaker against the motion is Rabbi Julia Neuberger, who was rabbi of the South London Liberal Synagogue. She's also written many books, of which the most recent is called The Moral State We're In. Julia Neuberger.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you all very much for coming. And I'm rather wondering what connection Roger Scruton is going to find with Methodist Central Hall after Nigel Spivey, as I, as a child, as a member of the West London Synagogue, used to come to overflow services for the High Holy Days here. And for those who know about the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, a fast day for 25 hours, can you imagine this hall, as full as it is now, with us all fasting and the scent of fish and chips slowly wafting up through the floor? So I have strong memories of my father conducting the services as a lay reader and being here. But perhaps that's not quite the meat of tonight's motion. I'm about as liberal a rabbi as you can be without falling off the edge. Nevertheless, I'm profoundly opposed to this motion. First, let's look at how religion is described. For the perception of religion that we've heard is simply one I largely don't recognise. It doesn't seem to recognise or understand the role of religion in many societies where the question of belief takes second place to how you mark your life events, how you're celebrated at birth and at maturation, how you mark marriage, childbirth, old age and death, how we mourn, how we betroth and how we divorce. Had you asked the members of my old congregation where I was rabbi for 12 years in South London whether they believed in a personal God, and if so, what the nature of that God was, they'd have looked completely astounded at you. Many of them weren't believers, as it appears. The opposition here, or perhaps I should say the proposition, understands it. They simply didn't feel like that. They weren't certain. For them, the idea that you would have creationism taught in schools would be simply appalling. Unlike people who are confirmed atheists, however, they had doubt, they had uncertainty. At some point in their lives, they had a sense of the other, of a different, superior presence within and beyond them, and on other days their doubts were stronger. But they behaved as if they held a stronger belief. They prayed, sometimes with true humility and piety, and sometimes out of habit, by rote, a bit like Nigel's Psalm 23, which is very comforting in times of trouble. They lived their lives according to the seasons of the religious festivals, celebrating Passover with its message of liberation from slavery, each year recognizing its moral message, but more or less certain as to whether it was divine intervention that caused the liberation at all. They marked the Day of Atonement, asking forgiveness for their sins, some years more, some years less conscious of a divine being that would listen to them. At best, they used this as a day to reflect, and the season beforehand to make peace with those they had offended in the previous year. At worst, it was a ritual recital of a recognition that we all do wrong, and that there's some value in a day of reflection on how we behave, and a form of what I can only describe as spiritual spring cleaning. I make the point to show that not all religion is theologically consistent. Indeed, when the greatest Jewish scholar of the 20th century, Rabbi Dr. Louis Jacobs, Alav HaShalom, was asked to write a book on Jewish theology for the Catholic publishers Darton, Longman and Todd, he insisted that they called it a Jewish theology because Jews have so many different views and so many different opinions. The old joke, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, isn't in fact a joke, but it's a statement of fact. Belief matters a good deal less than how you live your life. Indeed, the test of the good Jew is what you do and how you behave, and not really at all about what you believe. So one reason I feel so strongly that we wouldn't be better off without religion is that by no means all religion is fundamentalist, extreme, exclusive and damaging. At its best, it's something modest, inspiring and sustaining. The modern division, to my mind, should be seen as that between those full of certainty, who scorn the beliefs of others and have a dogma of their own that allows no real debate, and those who are occasionally full of doubt, but who are tolerant and who are respectful of other people's views. That division is by no means between the religious and the secular. The Crusades, Islamic, Jewish and Christian fundamentalism, fascism and communism are all the results of total certainty. For me, the moderates, religious or not, are the ones who need to unite, and those moderates within the religious world have much to give, to teach, and yes, also to learn. I've lived and worked within modern, non-orthodox, Enlightenment-influenced religious communities most of my adult life. Communities for whom the idea that revelation is a once and forever event is complete anathema, but for whom the idea that we are put into this world with a purpose, however dimly we may perceive it, is a given. With all the passionate rationalism that convinced atheists bring to bear, they miss the experiential, what motivates so many people to do good. It is that sense that we are here for a purpose to make the world a better place that has led so many to social reform that wouldn't otherwise have taken place. It was, for instance...
Christopher, we'll have the questions later, Christopher.
You'll get your turn. You'll get your turn. It was, for instance, religious sensibility that brought us hospice and palliative care. You may or may not share the convictions of those who developed it, but you could hardly deny that in terms of modern health care, the relief of pain of people who are dying has been one of the great advances, one that many really good scientists, desperate to find cures, simply didn't consider. Or take another example, that of slavery, the slave trade and its abolition, the bicentenary of which we're marking this week. Plenty of religious people were involved in the slave trade, and plenty of pretty irreligious people too. But it was the strong religious sensibilities of Wilberforce and his colleagues largely but not wholly Quaker and nonconformist Christians, that brought an end to the slave trade in Britain. Not soon enough, not humanly aware enough, but as a result of religious thinking from the Puritan tradition on, often profoundly influenced by that Old Testament God that so many people so deride. But they preached, they persuaded, they campaigned, they demonstrated, and they finally got the change through. We'll take a more recent example, the Make Poverty History campaign, which had a mixture of people of all ages, races, religions, communities present in Edinburgh nearly 2 years ago, and that has certainly influenced British politicians to give more aid. On those platforms, speaking to crowds of whom many were motivated by their religious feelings, there were imams and cardinals, rock singers and politicians, people of faith and none, gathered together inspired by a cause. The voices of the Hebrew prophets were powerful in the words of the speakers, religious or not, and Isaiah struck a chord amongst people opposed to religious force and form, but passionate about doing the right thing. I'm running out of time, but I want to make one last point, and that's about humility and the religious experience of living ordinary, faithful lives. Working as a communal rabbi, I saw ordinary people trying to live good lives who wanted and want to do the best they can in an imperfect world, to even up inequalities where they could, and to, if you like, try and campaign for social justice. They recognised an obligation to give 10% of their income away to charity each year. Some of them cared for profoundly disabled people, either at home as carers or professionally, giving service because of their sense of purpose. Anything but arrogant, they were bound together by a sense of duty to family, community, and the wider world. They were and are profoundly good people looking for honest ways to live honest, decent lives. In my view, if we didn't have religion, would be even more selfish, self-indulgent, certain and cruel, more than we already are. Religious people can without doubt be all those things, but they can at best change the world because they believe in moral purpose, experience a sense of inspiration above and beyond themselves, as many of us do, and inspired by their belief to act. Thank you.
The third speaker for the motion is Professor Anthony Grayling, Professor of Philosophy at Birkbeck College, author of many books about philosophy, Berkeley, Wittgenstein, Russell, biography of Hazlitt. He also wrote a book called What is Good? The Search for the Best Way to Live Appropriately. And his new book is called Against All Gods. Professor Grayling.
When one gets up to speak this late in a debate, one's a bit tempted to quote that Hungarian MP who, after a long discussion in the Parliament in Budapest, stood up and said, everything has been said, but not everybody said it yet. And it's my turn. Some of you might have noticed the news item today about the Pope Benedict XVI, giving a sermon last weekend in Rome and telling the congregation, reminding them perhaps, that hell is a real place. It's a palpable, tangible place, and the eternal fires of hell really exist, and those who don't accept Jesus, he said, I'm paraphrasing here, will roast eternally, but because of their failure to do so. And this shows how very up-to-date Pope Benedict is, because obviously he's heard about tonight's debate, and this is an intervention. Although I've been trying to work out all day on which side it's an intervention. And is he trying to persuade you to vote, against the motion, or is he actually a fifth columnist on our side of the argument? Well, it isn't clear. Now, I imagine a Martian PhD student. I suppose there are also PhD students from Venus as well, but this was a Martian PhD student who is studying the ethical systems on planet Earth, and has read all the documents, all the treatises, all the philosophical works, the scriptures, the teachings of the Holy Fathers, and has come to the point at which he's got to do some field work. And so he is beamed down by the Martian equivalent of Scotty, to Waterloo Station at rush hour, so there are plenty of people about. And he falls into conversation with people having coffee, waiting for their trains. And he asks them a question, actually rather an astute question. He doesn't ask them what they think is right and wrong, good or bad, and why. Instead, he asks them this. He says, what kind of people would you like your children to be when they grow up? He asks them this because he wants to get from them, to elicit from them, their very best thoughts about the best kind of life. And so he knows that he's going to catch them in a sober and well-judging frame of mind when they think seriously about what kind of people they'd like their children to become. And he finds, when he's talked to enough such people, that there's quite a consensus among them. They say things like this: I'd like my children to be responsible people. I'd like them to take responsibility for themselves, get an education, get a good job. I'd like them to have a family and friendships, deep friendships, because they're so valuable and enriching. And with their families, well, I'd like them to care for their children tenderly and carefully, and I'd like them to bring up their children to think for themselves and to take responsibility for themselves. I wouldn't want my children to be just always submitting to the authority of, I don't know, a politician or a teacher. Or, you know, I'd like them to be inquisitive and to inquire and to think for themselves. And then the Martian PhD student says to them, it's absolutely extraordinary that all you people say these things about what you want for your children, because this is nominally a Christian country, isn't it? I mean, and isn't it the case that even if you no longer actually believe the tenets of the Christian faith, you are sort of in the position of the young man from Moldavia? You remember that little poem? There was a young man from Moldavia, couldn't believe in the Saviour, so he erected instead, with himself as the head, the religion of decorous behaviour. And this was meant to be, deduced or inferred, at any rate, from the basis of Christian morality. But this nominally Christian country, says our Martian, how can it be that you've said what you said? It's astonishing. Because in the New Testament, you are taught to take no thought for the morrow. Consider the lilies of the field. Don't have a pension. Don't put money aside. Don't educate your children and help them to prepare for a future. Take no thought for the morrow. The lilies of the field don't, and yet you are not arrayed as these. Also, give away all your money. Give it away to the poor and follow me. Then you are going to, if you have possessions, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to get into heaven. The eye of the needle, well, we know how that's been glossed in the centuries since, but it just says it's more difficult for a rich person, a comfortably off person, to get into heaven and to pass through the eye than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. In other words, the teaching of the New Testament ethics, which I would submit to you is not bad as teachings of ethics go. It doesn't really compare to the great systems of Aristotle, let us say, or the Stoics, or of Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism is not a religion. It doesn't have any supernatural beings in it. It's a philosophy. Or of the moral outlook of the Enlightenment, or of some of the thinking about the good life, the well-lived, decent and responsible life today, none of which appeal to the existence of supernatural agencies as the source of a divine command. All right, it's not, the Christian ethical outlook is one of the better of those. And yet when you look at it and you see what it demands of you, it is very contrary to the way we think of a decent life now. And moreover, it says, I mean, I can imagine the Martian PhD hearing from his interlocutors on Waterloo Station that they want their children to be happy. Happy, says the Martian PhD student. I mean, it says, blessed are they who weep and mourn. I mean, don't you want them to be miserable so they can get into the afterlife? I mean, it looks as though there's such a radical inconsistency between one of the better religious ethical outlooks and what it is you want from your children, that it's very hard to know what to think about it. Because, after all, says the Martian, I've been reading all the documents. And as a result of reading them, I said to Scotty, the chap who beamed me down from Mars, I said, look, be very careful, won't you, about where I end up, both time and place. So I don't want to end up in Israel at the time of Moses, just in case they mistake me for a Midianite or an Amalekite or any of the others who were massacred. Please don't, make sure I don't end up in Spain in the late 15th century with Torquemada, or in Calvin's Geneva at the time he was burning Michael Servetus, or in Zwingli's Zurich when he was drowning the Anabaptists, or please not in today's Baghdad, Bombay, Beirut, even Belfast for that matter. Make sure you get me to Waterloo Station in 2007. Because when I'm not thinking about the better of the religious moralities in the Christian New Testament, gosh, really? I think about all these other teachings, I find that it is not simply a question of the teachings being very questionable, or not just a question of the practice allegedly based on those teachings, which is very questionable, but the entire assumption, the entire outlook about what it is to be a good person and to live a good and decent life, which is so at odds with the way we in our secularized modern Western liberal democracies have come to see as life of achieving and flourishing and doing well for others. And I end on this one note. Julia pointed out that, and so indeed did Nigel, that religion and its inspirations and the art it's produced and the rest have played a very important part in what you might call, and what I might, just speaking secularly, call the spiritual aspect of our lives, our emotional and intellectual responses, our enjoyment of beauty, our desire for love. And I mention this to you, as Hitch, in his eloquent intervention during that moment, was implying, those who don't have a religious outlook appreciate a fact about human beings, that for all their capacity for greed and unkindness and cruelty and the rest, they also have a remarkable capacity for the good, a deep sense of connectedness with other people and a desire to be connected with the world as a whole. You look at people in their gardens, or going for a walk in the country, or at a concert, or looking at pictures in an art gallery, and you see that you don't need supernatural agencies or religions or ancient scriptures to explain the fact that human beings are capable of good, and that most of the good that there is in the world has come from that source and not from some alleged supernatural source. Many thanks.
Bravo.
Our final speaker against the motion more of that later. Our final speaker against the motion is another philosopher. He is Roger Scruton, who has written many books upon his subject. He's written about aesthetics, he's written about music, philosophy of architecture, and he's written a book called Philosophy, Principles and Problems, into which perhaps this motion fits. So please welcome Roger Scruton.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you everybody for being here for this extraordinary debate. Rabbi Julia Neuberger asked, or suggested I might say something about my own connection with Methodist Hall. All I can say is that my father, when it crossed his mind that perhaps he should not bring his children up entirely without religion, searched our local town, High Wycombe, for the gloomiest chapel he could find. It was the Methodist, and we were duly sent there each Sunday. He not, of course, attending, being hoping to keep hold of the remaining bits of cheerfulness in his already gloomy personality. This had a very remarkable effect on me. It meant that I secretly went every Sunday, not to the Methodist chapel, but to the Anglican church, and also to confirmation lessons thereafter, not unconnected with the presence at those lessons of a very attractive girl in a white Macintosh. This was my first encounter with that aspect of the religious experience which some people call transcendental. And I have held on to it ever since, and I entirely agree with our first speaker, Dr. Spivey, that this is something that will never be removed from the human condition. Now, I have to speak as a philosopher, so I refer to one of the great philosophers, Plato, who set out to describe an ideal republic in which reason would prevail over passion and in which the citizens would be guided by the truth. It is fair to say that Plato found ordinary humanity to be a profound disappointment, as do most of the speakers on the other side. In all kinds of ways, people conspired against their own happiness by allowing the darker forces within to gain the upper hand. They amused themselves with poetry, which told them lies about the heroes and gods. In politics, they preferred consoling lies to uncomfortable truths, and so tied themselves in knots of self-deception. When it came to music, they had a distressing tendency to prefer the orgiastic tunes and rhythms of the pop stars, instead of the upright marches which bring order to the soul. All in all, human beings as they existed in Plato's day were on the side of disorder, falsehood, and irrationality. The only solution was to devise a new kind of society with the philosophers in charge and the forces of unreason expelled into the outer darkness. The poets would be ordered to leave, so too would the priests of Dionysus and other orgiastic cults, so too would the Corybants and the pop stars. People would be educated on a diet of pure philosophy, which would ensure that reason prevailed in every decision, and that the soul of the citizen would be as well ordered and harmonious as the soul of the state. Plato is only one of the many thinkers down the ages who have advocated an ideal of reason and reasonableness, and who have dismissed those aspects of the human condition which fail to conform to it. Plato was ambivalent about religion, since he believed that it had both rational and irrational forms. But he was adamant that the irrational forms were dangerous and that we would be better off without them. Suppose someone were to say that we would be better off without love. After all, love often leads to disaster. The love of Helen for Paris, for instance, which led to the Trojan War. Love brings with it jealousy, possessiveness, obsession, and grief. People can love the wrong things and the wrong people. They can go astray through love as they do through hatred. Most people in this room, I hope, would respond to that argument in the following way. They would say, whatever the disasters that love may cause, love, judged in itself and without regard to contingencies, is a human good. Perhaps the greatest of human goods. The important thing is to learn to love rightly and in the right frame of mind. The disasters, if they come, come as accidents and not by necessity. That is surely the response that should be made on behalf of religion. Of course, religion leads to disasters like the 30 Years' War. People can believe in false gods, attach themselves to evil rituals, and so on. Religion can exert a stultifying effect on the intelligence, imagination, and humanity of those who subscribe to it. Do we think that that is not true also of science sometimes? Anyway, none of those possibilities implies that there is not a proper development of the religious urge in which people learn to worship the right things in the right way. Christopher Hitchens travels around the world visiting places beginning with the letter B, and discovering all around him insoluble conflicts. Maybe that's partly his problem, but of course those conflicts exist. But is religion the cause of them, or just one of the ways in which they are expressed? Visiting one of those places beginning with the letter B once, namely Beirut, in the middle of the Civil War, I went out of the city to a nunnery nearby, in the countryside nearby, in which all kinds of victims of the Civil War had found refuge and were being looked after by a little nun. And I said to her, "How on earth can you cope with this influx of damaged people? What are you to do about it?" And she said to me something very simple. She said, "Que le bon Dieu est bon. On lui donne comme ça, et il nous rend comme ça." She opened her arms and said, "He gives us back 10 times what we offer him." And what had he offered her? He had offered her the ability to look after damaged people of every faith and restore them to a sense of normality and to live life again. That seemed to me to be an adequate expression of the religious urge. Now, but to defend the religious urge, we have to know what kind of thing we, as religious people, are. And this is the place where philosophy has something to say. What part of our nature draws us to religion? And what is needed if that part is to be rightly guided? Science and logic are not the only spheres in which our reason shows itself. We seek for the causes of things, but we also seek for their meaning. We have moral values, aesthetic tastes, yearnings and aspirations, which, for want of a better word, we call spiritual. Such things are not irrational, even if we find it difficult to provide a scientific foundation for them. Indeed, it is only a rational being who experiences the world in this way, in terms of meanings, values, tastes and aspirations, and who feels, as a result, the tension between his life and his ideals. There is nothing irrational in this. On the contrary, not to feel it is to be only half alive to the human condition. It is what I suspect Christopher Hitchens felt, seeing the disasters which he encountered as a journalist. People who do not convey to us, in whatever way, an awareness of their shortcomings do not attract our sympathy. They're not really of our kind. And isn't it plausible to think that it is precisely this aspirational side of people that draws them to religion? As rational beings, we cannot be satisfied with causal explanations only. The question why has for us another meaning. Not what is the cause, but what is the reason. For what end does this or that exist? For Professor Dawkins, religion has nothing to say about what life is for, so he said to us. But in fact, it's precisely religion which addresses the question what life is for, as opposed to what caused it. As rational beings, we look for meanings, connections, harmonies and symmetries. We want the world to make sense to us and to answer our questions not merely in the way the laws of nature answer the inquiries of a scientist, but in the way that the laws of harmony answer the aspirations of a musician. Our reason overreaches the bounds of science, and this is not a deficiency in our reason, but a deficiency in science. Moreover, as rational beings, we make an absolute distinction between right and wrong, good and evil, virtue and vice, and we found our lives on the belief that some things are intrinsically worthwhile and to be pursued for their own sake. Not pleasure only, but love, duty, virtue and kindness. We can't mount a deductive or scientific argument in favour of those values, for all that Professor Grayling says, but we condemn those who condemn them and believe that reason is on our side. All those facts about the human condition dispose us to look for the places where we can stand, as it were, at the window of our empirical world and gaze out towards the transcendental, the places from which light from that other sphere floods over us as it flooded over that little nun in the nunnery near Beirut. There is nothing irrational in looking for these places or in the thought that we find them by locating what is sacred, sacred words, sacred texts and sacred rituals. Now, I don't deny that there are wrong ways of pursuing this religious quest. Those for whom faith is a call to arms are obviously a threat to all of us. But although they make the most noise, they are not the most numerous among religious people. For most people, religion is what it has always been, a cultivation of piety, a humility in the face of creation, and an attempt to live according to a shared moral code. That is what reason demands, and it is only those who have a narrow and stultifying view of human reason, who wish to reduce it like Plato to the abstract pursuit of philosophy, or to reduce it still further like Professor Dawkins to the more concrete pursuit of science, who would wish to banish religion from our ideal republic. It is only such people who are, in my view, the enemies of reason, who could imagine that this constant companion of our species, which has been at our side through all our sorrows and all our joys, is somehow superfluous to our real requirements and can be kicked out of the city gates, along with all the art and poetry and music that makes no sense without it, and all the aspirations and ideals that it implants in the ordinary human soul. Thank you.
Now, the subject is now up for debate, but before we begin, I will give you the result of the pre-vote, which you voted for as you came in. And on the motion, we'd be better off without religion. There were 826 votes for, 681 against, which is a majority for the motion of 145, but there were 364 don't knows. So this is time to make up your mind. There are microphones in each of the different areas, and I'm happy to take questions and put them to the different people on the platform. There's one conspicuously here at the moment, but I'd like to take several at once. Let's start with that one.
Hi,
Can someone take a microphone over there too for me, please? Yes.
Hi, could I ask Professor Grayling, Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, if they are strict materialists or physicalists, by which I mean that absolutely nothing exists except the physical universe, or if they're willing to allow for the possibility of a further reality, or indeed realities, other than the physical universe.
Right, who will take that question?
I don't
Anthony?
mind. I'm the least qualified, so perhaps I'd be the one.
Richard,
can you hear me? Well, I thought I had a microphone.
Well, can you hear him now? The microphone's on, yes?
Is it on or not?
Yeah.
Well, as the least qualified, I think I could probably be the most brief. I don't believe anyone on the other side can tell me that there's a non-material universe. It's a matter of Occam's razor, really, ladies and gentlemen. Those who say they know that there's a God, which is what a religious person must believe. They can't say it's optional. They can't say it's another name for human rights or charity. They must say they do believe there is something supernatural that provides faith. They can't get out of it like the rabbi tried to, by confusing it with good works. They must also say, if they're religious, that God knows what we should do, what we should eat, with whom we should have sex, in what positions, and so forth. If they don't say that, they're not religious. I'm very sorry. Now, I think it's very easy to tell right away. I may not know, in fact, I don't believe with my cranial capacity, even Professor Dawkins' cranial capacity, it's possible to know what's happening with dark material. We may never be able to know. But don't put your trust in anyone who says that they do. Those people are eliminated from the argument right away. They cannot be right. They have been practicing an imposture on the human species for centuries, for millennia. We happen to live in the lucky period where their claims have been found to be false or superfluous or supererogatory. There is therefore no other way in which you can decide your vote tonight.
Professor Dawkins.
I would just add to that the science of any one century is going to be superseded by the science of future centuries, such that if somebody from, say, the Middle Ages were to be brought back by a time machine to now, they would find mobile phones and computers and jet aeroplanes. They would be indistinguishable from magic. They would appear to be supernatural. So I am a materialist. I don't believe there is anything supernatural. But don't think of that as a denigration of the natural, because if you were to come back in 500 years' time, you wouldn't have seen nothing yet. The physics, the engineering, the biology of 500 years' time will be so far advanced over today's that we might well fall on our knees and worship it as supernatural, but it wouldn't be. It would be the evolved natural.
Anthony, do you want to add to that?
Yes, just very quickly, I second both those sets of remarks, of course. I just want to add, though, that thinking that there is just the natural world governed by natural laws and that there aren't supernatural entities or agencies in the universe, still less any that have any direct interest in, as Hitch says, what we wear and what we eat and when and so on. In thinking that, one mustn't, again, fall into another trap, which is to think that somehow your attitude to the natural world is one of so-called fundamentalist certainty. And the great thing about the scientific mindset is its acceptance of open texture, of the fact there are lots of things we don't know and understand, and we're looking for and trying to understand, and we're prepared not to leap to closure, to leap to a neat, easy story to understand, which tells us what the beginning was and what the end's going to be. Now, very often, in the case of people who appeal to religions to provide that kind of explanation, what they're doing is that they're answering the question, why is there a world, by saying, well, because Fred made it, as if that answered anything. Substitute God for Fred there, by the way. Or, you know, why are we here? Because Fred wants us to be. You haven't answered anything if you give a supernaturalistic answer to it. But the fact that there are lots of unanswered questions in science is just the fact about this preparedness, the intellectual courage to go on not knowing all the answers, but looking for them.
As actually Professor Sidney Morgenbesser said, when asked the question, why is there something rather than nothing, said, if there was nothing, you'd still be complaining.
Right, I'm going to wrap up several questions together now, otherwise people won't. There's somebody over there, there's somebody here, and there's someone up there. So can we hear those three questions, please? Yes.
I want to ask a question that I think many of us think about when we're parents. I want to ask Baroness Julia Neuberger about our children. What are they going to believe? My children, I have 3, one's a doctor, but they don't go to church or to synagogue or to any religious ceremony. What will happen to them and their children? What will their children believe? Could you give me some indication, please, of what to predict what is going to happen to religion in the future?
Right,
thank you very much.
We'll hold over that question. Julia's made a note of it, I'm sure. Yes.
Madam Chairman, Christopher Hitchens seems to imply that unless one practices one's religion to 100% of its tenets, it's not worth practicing. Now, I regard myself as what I call a line-drawing Jew. I don't practice all 613 tenets of the law. I draw the line and practice those which I do. But in my book, religion is about 3 things. It's about a code of living, it's a framework by which we live, and it teaches self-restraint. Now, that's nothing to do with Judaism. It applies to all the main religions. And Professor Dawkins, would you not have that taught to the children at an early stage?
Fine, we'll take that question on board. And then there's a question up there, I believe. Yes? No, we can't hear you.
How about now?
Yes.
It's a question for Dr. Spivey. Do you think that the slaughtered millions and hundreds killed every day in the name of faith are better off for the existence of the Sistine Chapel and some pretty paintings?
Right, the first question about what are we to tell the children, Julia Neuberger.
Well, I don't know what you tell the children, in that I think that you were really asking me to predict what they will believe. I can only say this, and it's something that worries me. I describe myself as about as liberal as you can get without falling off the edge, and I rather resent, I must say, Christopher Hitchens telling me what a religious person has to believe. I think I'm the rabbi and he's probably not. But nevertheless, let me come to the point about what I think will happen. And I think it's terribly worrying. I think a lot of our children will be people who hold no very clear belief. It'll be a rather woolly mush, I would say, if they have much in the way of belief at all. We've desensitized them, I think, very often to those things about religion that I believe matter. What I think is extremely worrying is seeing a rise of extreme religion, so that their children, your grandchildren, may well be the ones who are sent to faith schools, may well be the ones who are given a rather extreme and somewhat separatist and intolerant view, because I think we're going into a cycle where that is going to be more and more acceptable. And as somebody who believes that the moderates should band together, whether religious or not, I think we should be very, very worried about the move towards extreme religious belief and the desire to teach all our children in separate boxes rather than together. But I think the generation of our children have got a problem.
Christopher Hitchens, will you take the question about, Christopher, the question of...
I'm sorry?
The question about the line-drawing Jew, the practice of religion being about the tone of living, a framework, and about self-restraint.
Well, that's dead easy, just like the rabbi just now. His religion is man-made too. He decides what he'd like to believe. It's a la carte. He says, shouldn't my children be taught, self-restraint, responsibility, care for others, and so on? I don't believe in the rest of it, don't believe in the prophets, don't believe in the mountaintop, don't believe in the revelation. Well, nor should you. But how dare you suggest to us that we couldn't teach our children self-restraint and respect for others and the golden rule? How dare you?
Dr. Spivey, I think the question put to you about whether the slaughtered millions were worth the Sistine Chapel was something of a rhetorical question, but would you have a comment to make on it?
Yes, it was slaughtered millions every day in the name of faith, and that's quite a rhetorical exaggeration of the thing. And it's also twisting what I was saying about the nexus of art and religion. I would argue that the Sistine Chapel is one of those things that shows humanity at its best, and a religious conflict one of the things that shows us at our worst. I don't buy this idea that if we were all suddenly to cease being religious, which, as I've tried to argue, is, I think, physically and psychologically impossible, that there would be a complete absence of ethnic or any other kind of conflict. And that strikes me as incredibly naive.
Thank you. Can I... Another clutch of questions. We're not going to get, the hands are going up everywhere. I apologise now that we won't get them all in, but there's one over there, and one over there, and one over here, but I'm looking for one up here. Is there one up there? Yes, okay, there's somebody over there, so that's 4. Can you be quite quick, please?
A question for Professor Scruton. If religion is essentially the creation of meaning out of brute matter, then do you think it's possible to make a religion of secularism? And if it is, do you think that the proposers of this motion are its high priests?
Okay, Roger. Yes, the question here.
I disagree that we need religion to teach us that flowers are beautiful, and that without religion, or with religion, we'd still kick over sandcastles. I would therefore question whether anybody could explain to me whether an actual fact would be, I think that we'd be much the same without religion, and I would like somebody to tell me other than that.
Fine, okay. And a question up here?
I would broadly support this motion, but I got one little doubt, which was alluded to by the first speaker, and that is that perhaps we're somehow hardwired for religion. And I think perhaps there's some evidence for a genetic predisposition to a religious belief and so on, and therefore perhaps it persists because of natural selection. And I just wanted to ask Professor Dawkins whether that might be a good argument for why it persists, or whether it's perhaps an indirect consequence of something else that we're better off with.
Okay, and the 4th question, yes.
Is this on? Oh, that's better. It's an observation and a question. The observation is seemed to be from this side seemed to be an argument for transcendence rather than for religion. Perhaps the anti-side of the anti-side might clarify that a little bit. But the question is to the panel, which is: do they think that there may be, given the contingencies of history and culture that created religion in the first place, there might be an opening of a space that could give us all the great Kandinsky-like transcendence without the thousands of corpses? Could that be a possibility?
Thank you. Okay, Roger, would you take the question about the secularism being its own religion and these being its high priests?
Well, this is a slightly cheeky suggestion. If what Dr. Spivey says is right, and I'm inclined to agree with him, then of course there is a religious need in all of us, and if the religious belief systems that we've inherited are suddenly, for whatever reason, unpersuasive, it is obviously true that if what he says is true, people will look for other ways of satisfying the religious urge. They will write passionate books condemning the old religious belief, perhaps called the God delusion or something like that, and accuse the advocates of the false sciences of heresy, and maybe indeed wish to represent themselves as the saviours of mankind. And to that extent, it is obviously true that we do have a kind of religious urge, a much more vehement religious urge, on the other side of this debate than on this one. We are downstream from all those religious conflicts. I suspect us on this table. We recognise with a certain element of sadness our inability to go out and kill on behalf of our faith, which Professor Dawkins has obviously not lost. So maybe it is true.
Would one of the high priests like to respond? Richard?
I face two questions. Firstly, is religion true? And second, is it necessary for human psychological welfare or something of that sort? If it isn't true, then for anybody to maintain that somehow humans need it and you're wasting your time trying to get rid of it, what an amazingly patronizing and condescending thing to say. We intellectuals, of course, know that it's not true, but all those poor people out there, they need religion. I mean, what a condescending thing to say about all those people. Either it's true or it's not. And I have enough respect for people to say that if it's not true, people will reconcile themselves to that and will not find any need for it. Now, I was asked a specific question, is it in the genes? Is there some Darwinian reason for religiosity? Maybe there is, but that doesn't bear in the slightest degree on whether it's true. I care about whether it's true. I also care, as a Darwinian, about the origin of it, and I'm interested in the origin of it, and I'm inclined to agree with the implied suggestion of the questioner that it may be that religion itself has no advantage, but it may be that it's a byproduct of some other psychological disposition which does. But that is an entirely separate question from whether it's true, and I don't like it when people say, oh, humans need it, or we have it built into us in our genes, or Darwinian natural selection is built into it, therefore that somehow validates it. Of course it doesn't validate it. It merely says that it's been built into us by natural selection, just as all sorts of other probably disagreeable things have been built into us. Doesn't mean we can't try to cure ourselves.
Right. Okay, can I just... Quickly.
The point about transcendence.
Well, I was going to actually put that to Roger Scruton as it was addressed to that particular side of the argument.
But we
I think
were asked
that's only fair.
if we could have transcendence without thousands of bodies, and I'd like to speak to that. Just very briefly. The answer, of course, is yes. I mean, it's a wonderful fact about human beings that they have this yearning for the absolute, that they sense the numinous, that in moments of great passion, infatuation, deep love, they feel that they're in touch with something which is richly important to them in their experience. Those are facts about human beings. In order to explain those facts, you don't have to go to the supermarket of ideas and take a deep frozen box out which says Islam or Christianity or something. You don't need that explanation. This is just a fact about us, and a very wonderful fact about us, and it may be that we can express that all the more wonderfully if we didn't try to parcel it up in these explanations, which are in so many other ways irrational.
And might I just
yes, Christopher?
A sentence to add to this. We don't want people to live without wonder or mystery, and in fact we thoroughly recommend, take a look through the Hubble telescope. See if you can get over what you see, the unbelievable beauty and symmetry and majesty of what you'll see. And you want to exchange this for the burning bush? I don't think you will once you've done it. Read a page of Stephen Hawking on the event horizon, for example, and see if that isn't awe-inspiring enough for anybody. And you're seeing there the future of a potentially much more noble and ennobled and enlightened and emancipated humanity, where none of these discoveries and none of this awe and majesty requires that you kill anyone in the name of some man-made idol or god or superstition. For heaven's sake, let's get this out of the way.
Roger,
I think that there is a real question as to what transcendence is and what its place is in the experience of all of us. Christopher Hitchens just referred to the burning bush. The voice that spoke from that bush said, "I am that I am." It reminded us of this very peculiar word which all of us use, the word I, which doesn't identify any material object in the world in which we are situated, but nor does it identify any object out of that world. Just what does it mean? What is it to look at somebody, into somebody's eyes and see the other eye that's looking out at you? That is an experience of transcendence in itself. It is the raw material from which all religious faith is constructed, and it is part of the metaphysical obscurity and unintelligibility of our predicament, that we're all faced with this experience every day. and religion makes sense of it for many people. Even for those who don't have religion, that experience is still there.
I have to move on quickly. The final two questions, one up there and one here. And then we have to have the revote and a summary from each of the speakers. It's going to have the questioner from up there, please.
Good evening. Question for Richard Dawkins and and Christopher Hitchens. By what measure do you conclude fact? And does Darwinism satisfy that measure? In other words, how do you protect yourself from deception, and how did Darwinism or evolution pass that filter?
Fine. Are you taking that on board? This question here?
Yes, I'm from the National Secular Society, and I'd like to ask the opponents of the motion whether they think that life for women and homosexuals would have been better or worse without religion.
Fine.
Thank you.
Okay. Fine. A question about the measure. The measure, I wasn't quite sure what the speaker asked.
Fact.
Yes.
The measure of the factuality of evolution is the same as in any other science. Some of the things that scientists have found are found with great confidence. Scientists are always open to the possibility of being proved wrong at some point in the future, but there are some things that seem at any one stage in history far better demonstrated than others. The fact of evolution is about as well demonstrated as anything we know. It is absolutely certain by the normal standards, the same kind of standards as we are certain that the Earth rotates and the Sun doesn't go around the Earth. Formally, we have to say, well, that's a hypothesis that might one day be disproved, but we all know that it won't be. And evolution has now come into that category. I don't mean that Darwin's theory of natural selection, at least as the only driving force of evolution, that probably should be treated as slightly more uncertain. But the fact of evolution itself, by which I mean the fact that all living creatures that have ever been looked at on this planet are cousins sharing a common ancestor, that is as secure a fact as any in science.
And the question...
Only because I was named,
Please.
Because I was asked by name, I feel very tentative to second Professor Dawkins in this area, but I would just remind you of what Carl Sagan said on this, which was, he said that there is no doubt that evolution has occurred. It's in the molecular biological record, it's in the fossil record. There are disputes about how it occurred. The Darwinian theory is only the original one of how that might have taken place. And Darwin himself set out as an original taxonomist in order to prove the truth of Christianity, just as Sir Isaac Newton believed in alchemy and Joseph Priestley, the discoverer of oxygen, believed in the phlogiston theory. We are always ready, all of us on this side, to be self-critical, to have a war within the war among scientists, among those who believe in innovation, evidence, hypotheses, and their testing. But that's entirely different from anything that is based on faith, on the supernatural, or on revelation, all of which belongs to the abject childhood of our species, before these things could even be discussed. There's no contest between the two magisteria, if you like.
Can I finally put the last question to the people who oppose the motion, which is, would the lot of women and homosexuals be better without religion? Julia?
I think it depends where. I think there are present extreme forms of religion that persecute women and certainly persecute homosexuals. I think when you look historically at religions that we recognise and at pre-religious times, and Nigel can talk more about that, you would see tremendous bad treatment of women, and I suspect that historically things have got marginally better for women and not a lot better for homosexuals within the main religious traditions. I have to say, in the non-orthodox religious traditions across the faiths, the position of women and of homosexuals has improved hugely. But don't forget that science also treated women and treated homosexuals extremely badly. until the 1970s, in my certain knowledge, gays were being treated with electroconvulsive therapy as a form of medical treatment. I'm not sure what the evidence was for that. And don't forget that the description of hysteria as something that particularly affected women because of their wombs was also apparently a scientific thing. I'm not blaming scientists for that. I'm just saying that historically, people have treated both women and homosexuals and indeed black people and all sorts of other minorities very badly. I think religion can give you insights to treat people better and equally, and I'm not sure you can blame religion for it all.
Roger, would you like? Nigel.
I can't see the particular questioner, but if you'll pardon, as Judah said, a historical reference. Never in human history have gay men enjoyed better rights than in classical Athens in the 5th century before Christ. The only way that a woman could get any position of power or respect in that society was to become a priestess. The gay men were given rights essentially because they believed in an almighty god, Zeus, who was himself a gay man. So one can bat these things back and forward, and I could say you wouldn't have a Hippocratic oath without religion. You wouldn't have orphanages without religion. There would be children scrambling up the chimneys of this capital without religion. But in a sense, it's beside the point. It's beside the point. The point is that there are many manifestations of our religious impulse. Some of them are appalling, and others of them are thoroughly ennobling. But we have them all the same. And no one on the other side, however many books they publish, however many documentaries they make, is going to get rid of it.
Thank you. We're running late, and I know many of you probably have dinner appointments, but I'm now going to ask for a summing up from each of the people in turn. I'm going to ask them for 2-minute summing up of what they have thought throughout the evening. But while they're doing that, you will be voting, and you will have brought into the hall a card like this. Please tear it in half and vote either for or against the motion. And if you wish to abstain, then don't tear it and put the whole lot into the box. People will come round with the boxes, and while they are doing that, we will hear from each of the speakers in turn. Okay? If you're going to hear them, you'll have to...
You need a spare one?
Yeah, well, it's okay, because Okay. Right, before the groundswell of conversation gets too loud, I'm going to ask Christopher Hitchens to summarise what his feelings are at the end of this debate. Christopher.
I think I'll address myself principally to Dr. Spivey, who has ducked the motion not by saying that religion should be transcended, or we would be better off if it were to be, but rather like Dr. Scruton has simply said, well, we can't hope to. We're stuck with it. Well, that's not what the motion says. The motion says, suppose we could, as some of us have, transcended the supernatural and the superstitious, would our example, if followed, not be a superior one? I think we've made a pretty strong case for that. I'll correct him also on another point, a very common misapprehension, and I'll try and demonstrate in doing so that we are not on this side deaf to the numinous, as it were. It is flat out not true to say that Karl Marx referred to religion as an opiate or an opium. What he says, I can quote it from memory, from his contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, is this. He says, religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of the heartless world, the spirit of the spiritless situation. It is an opiate for the sufferer, for the people. So he goes on to say, the demand to give up its illusion is the demand to give up the condition that requires illusions. And he closes by saying that criticism has plucked the flowers from the chain, not so that men and women may wear the chain without consolation, but so that they may break the chain and cull the living flower. Now, the fact that you've been lied to about what he said all this time by religious spokesmen shouldn't conceal from you the knowledge that we have a very clear understanding of where this impulse comes. I actually don't like the Sistine Chapel. I didn't like it even before I knew that every brick of St. Peter's was raised by the sale of indulgences, which obviously changes nothing for Dr. Scruton either, by a special sale of indulgences, by the way. But I do like the Parthenon very much, and I've written a book about it. And I think as an achievement of artistic symmetry and architectural glory, it probably has no Christian rival. But I believe that I can. In fact, I know I can. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has been there and said and appreciated and loved it without having to subscribe to the superstitions of the Eleusinian mysteries, to the cult of Athena and Zeus, to the Melian expedition and the Peloponnesian War, to slavery and Athenian imperialism, and to human sacrifice. We can have our Parthenon, and we can indeed recover it from what was done to it by Byzantine Ottomans, by Venetian Catholics, by National Socialist barbarians and many others. We can still have it. It's our common property without the superstitions that go with it, without the dread and fear and sacrifice, the terrified, cringing humanity that was so much sheltered under the walls as it was being raised. And the word for that, the ability to have these things, to have John Milton's poetry, to have Philip Larkin's poem Church-Going, to have Shakespeare, without the superstition, is called culture, on which we've all laid our lives, on which we've all sworn to defend ourselves and our civilization against, especially now, precisely against religious barbarism, against those who know they are right, against those who say they only need one book, against those who say they know God's on their side, against those who say there's a revelation. That's what culture is, that's what we're defending. Yes, we'd be better off with culture, and yes, we can have it without religion, which is a mind-forged manacle. Thanks.
Thank you. Nigel?
At the risk of confusing everyone, can I try and organise a straw vote? I mean, a hands in the air sort of vote. And can I ask you to be absolutely...
We're taking a vote right now, really.
No, this is something different, Joan. This is a question. It's not about... It could have been about who in this audience has ever shown violence against their laptop. But I'll use a Wittgensteinian example. Hands up, and don't be bashful about this. I'm going to start off putting my own hand up. Who in this room has ever, or can ever remember, kissing a photograph? Slightly less than I might have anticipated, but if you've done that, you have behaved as, in a sense, Wittgenstein is saying, we all behave as ceremonious animals. We do things that don't have reason behind them. We do things for performance. We will go into, I don't want this to become all about St. Peter's in Rome, but you know there's a bronze statue there of St. Peter, and so many people have touched the toe of St. Peter that the toe has almost disappeared.
Hunter, you're kissing.
What?
No, okay.
We do silly things. We die on behalf of a friend. And they're things that scientists can't explain. That is my scientific view, which I restate. My personal view, and it's voiced with the glum awareness that Methodist chapels are currently closing at a rate of 100 a year. One lady said over there, what are our children going to believe? What if the motive that William James said was the religious motive? It's uneasiness. That's all he says. When you feel uneasy and you want to connect to some sort of form of hope, when things become imponderable or incomprehensible, you become uneasy. You might do this by imagining a higher power or expressing yourself in this religious way. What if that uneasiness does indeed disappear? What if people no longer feel uneasy about the fact that there might be more to life than filling a trolley at Tesco's? It's conceivable. And at that point, I surrender, like Samuel Beckett. I sort of hold my hands up and say, you know, I'll go and sit in an empty church while everyone else is carousing and just get miserable. But when the next Robespierre or Stalin or Himmler organizes us into a truly irreligious society and sends me to their version of hell, one that they've created, I'm going to go there with the letters of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in my pocket, and yes, I'll be crooning some of those hymns that nobody croons anymore, the hymns of Charles Wesley. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard. Professor Dawkins.
Although I can't recall ever having kissed a photograph, I have wept when reading poetry, when listening to music. I think that those on this side have come to rather resent the suggestion that religion has a monopoly on emotion, on poetry. On sympathy, on empathy. Everybody in this room, I dare say, has felt deep grief at the sight or the thought of a suffering individual somewhere in the world, maybe even of another species. That does seem to be something in humanity, to feel empathy with suffering. And as a Darwinian, I can offer explanations for that. I won't do it now because there isn't time. But it is a travesty that has somehow become widely accepted that if you throw out religion, you throw out the Good Samaritan, you throw out weeping at a sonnet of Shakespeare or at a Schubert quartet. It has nothing whatever to do with religion in the sense of the supernatural. Of course, you can redefine religion as covering all these emotional, artistic aspects. And in that case, of course, there's no contest. But I suggest that that's confusing and that we need to define religion as belief in something supernatural. You get your beliefs not from evidence, but from faith, from revelation, from tradition, from scripture, from authority. Now, all those are very bad reasons to believe anything. Evidence is the only reason to believe something. And that's the second point that I want to make in closing. But the first one, the main one I want to make, is that we are all in this together. We are all capable of the same kinds of emotions. We're all capable of wanting to free the slaves and all the things, all the good things that have been talked about, whether we're religious or not. You cannot give religion the credit for any of those things. They are a part of humanity. The good things are part of humanity, just as the bad things are part of humanity, whether you are religious or not.
Julia Neuberger?
Well, I think I'm sure. In fact, I'm sure I've never knowingly kissed a photograph. I can't imagine why I would. I'd rather kiss the real person, I think, at least if it was somebody I wanted to kiss. I'm left thinking that we have a confusion here. We're having a definition of religion, which seems to me to be not like a definition I recognise as somebody who comes from the moderate wing of religion. It seems to me that the voices of the prophets may help you to do the right thing, and I'm not for one single moment suggesting that people who aren't religious don't do the right thing. But when we hear something like Isaiah saying, not interested in the forms of religion, but actually in the moral truth, that stirs me and it stirs many other people. Your countless sacrifices, what are they to me? The offer of your gifts is useless. It's new moons and Sabbaths I can't endure. But when you get cease to do evil and learn to do right, pursue justice and champion the oppressed, give the orphan his rights and plead the widow's cause, it's not the ritual that matters, but the moral cause. It strengthens my resolve. It strengthens lots of people's resolve. It sensitizes you to issues of justice. And for many of us, religious but not fundamentalist, There is a voice of God that we can hear within us, and yes, I suppose, in Richard Dawkins' terms, that is a supernatural. It may be our consciences, a prick of shame or guilt at what we've done, or perhaps even worse, what we haven't done. And we live our lives aware that we're being judged by ourselves first and foremost, but also by something above and beyond us for whom we always fall short. Now, we can believe that without certainty, and we can wonder at creation along with Richard Dawkins, believing in evolution too. You don't have to be an extremist to be religious. But without religion, our world is the poorer.
Anthony Grayling. Anthony?
Oh, I'm so sorry, yes. Lost in thought for a moment there. I think it's perfectly clear from the conversation that we've had among us this evening that to do good, to be good, to want the good, to want it to prevail, you don't have to be anything. You don't have to be a subscriber to Hinduism or the Olympian gods or the Norse gods or anything. In fact, on the contrary, if you look back across the landscape of history and you see how humanity has been loaded with suffering and division and conflict as a result of religious differences, you look back, you see that early Christians of different sects who loathed one another so much that when they were thrown to the lions, they used to run to opposite ends of the thing so they wouldn't be eaten by the same lions. And you look at what's happening in Baghdad today, you think of the way history screams at us with gory throats about the atrocities that have been committed in the name of faith. And you ask yourself, isn't it the case that these very natural, very warm feelings that human beings can have for one another when they know one another individually, and it becomes impossible to generalize? And if you know somebody from another nation or another culture, another ethnicity, you know somebody well personally, it's very, very hard to continue to generalize, to accept the sorts of divisions that people want to impose because of labels, because of the identities that they choose for themselves. And you see that the deepest division that has existed between people in human history, recorded human history, is the set of religious differences which has been productive of so much conflict and suffering. And you think of that and you move to the individual sphere. You think of the teenager who is anxious because his private feelings may be leading him into sin, or he's done something that may damn his immortal soul because he's been told that it will. You think about the torment of that. So on every scale, you can think of ways in which religion, religious belief, religious hegemony, religious oppression has stood in the path of the good. And we know from the historical record how organized religious bodies have resisted tooth and nail every inch of progress that's been made in science. Look at the history of the modern West, for example, since the Reformation. The desire to increase the liberty of the individual against the desire of religion supporting absolute monarchy to keep control over individuals. The idea of the secret policeman who sees what you do in the dark, it's a wonderful instrument of control over people's minds. And what has been sought in the period of time that has elapsed since the Reformation has been an increasing margin of discretion for individuals to make their own choices, make up their own mind, and to live a life which is free of those trammels, in which their imagination and their will is not loaded down with ancient stories that come from the infancy of humankind. Would we be better off without religion? So much better off, if only we could breathe the free air of our personal liberty, our choice, our freedom to love one another as human beings and cooperate with one another, not because of labels, not because we don't want to go to hell, but because we choose to.
And finally, Roger Scruton.
I think that there's a misunderstanding on the part of those who've been proposing the motion as to what we on our side have actually been saying. I don't think anybody here has wished to deny the atrocities committed in the name of faith, though if we are to reduce this argument to that kind of head counting, we ought at least to acknowledge the atrocities committed in the name of atheism, in the last century especially. Mao Zedong, Stalin, Lenin, Hitler and a few others are pretty impressive in this regard, but these are very vulgar and unimportant arguments for us. We know that nobody in this room is remotely tempted in that direction. The real question is what religion can do in the lives of people like us. Is it something that can benefit us, or is it something that will harm us? Now, I think Professor Dawkins is absolutely right to say that religion does not produce the moral and aesthetic emotions that so many of us value. It is not at least the only producer of those things. They lie deep in human nature, perhaps alongside the religious urge, but separable from it. The question is, having been separated, do they have the same chance of survival? Now, my view is that this question is not about the truth of any particular religion, and I don't think that the question of the truth of religion is a scientific question anyway. It's a question, as Thomas Aquinas recognized, of the ultimate dependence of existence, of being, on some ground or some final explanation. But I don't think the question is about truth. The question is about whether our religious feelings, which undeniably exist, can be focused rightly or wrongly, and if they're focused rightly, whether they produce the kind of redemptive effect in our experience that religious people claim. And I would say that if focused rightly on the creator of the universe, who created it out of all-embracing love, then they will always reflect well in our individual lives.
Thank you, Roger. Before I announce the result, I would just like to say that each of these distinguished speakers is prepared to sign books that they have written, which are out there. What a captive moment, just as you want the result, but you should know that. Also, I would, before you all rush off the moment I've given the result, say how grateful we all are for hearing this debate tonight. It's been effective in making up a lot of minds. There are only 100 don't knows. And the vote now for the resolution that we'd be better off without religion is 1,205, and against, that's also gone up, 778. So the motion is carried. Thank you.